Once you learn about this secret about the Overtriggers, it will blow your mind and you will understand why Bushiroad designed these things in the way they are. Stand up! Vanguard! So these last couple of days have been super hyped for the community with everything about Overdress, and the consensus is that a lot of people are pretty hyped about what's gonna happen. And same has been on for me and on this channel. Like, we've been talking about Overdress non-stop ever since this Tuesday once the big bombshell dropped. And this is probably going to be the case for the foreseeable future. Heck, even this video is still about the new information about Overdress. As in this particular video, and better said, this particular weekend, I want to discuss two more pointers about the Overdress announcement, which are a bit iffy in the community. And what I mean with that is basically the two changes to the game where we have people saying, alright, this could be amazing, but at the same time, why did they did this, and is this really good? And those two pointers are, of course, the new Overtriggers and the new addition in the format system, where we now are going to have 3 different formats instead of the previous 2. So today I want to focus about these Overtriggers and discuss them a little bit and give my opinion about them. And then tomorrow I want to go over the formats themselves, because there is to say for both sides, because this new dynamic in formats themselves brings an interesting aspect to the entirety of the game, but I will go in more detail in that separate video. Now, as for this video, we're going to talk about Overtriggers in general, and at the end of the video, I will share the secret about Overtriggers, which I discovered not too long ago, which changes the perspective around these triggers, and you can understand why Bushiroad designed them the way they are. So for anybody that isn't aware what Overtriggers are, they are basically special types of triggers which we may only include one of in our entire deck. And how they function is they're just like your normal typical trigger, but the difference is that they have 100 million power and they have a special effect if they're drive checked during your actual drive check. So if you drive check them, you get the 100 million power and you get a special effect. But if you damage check them, it's just the 100 million power and not a special effect. Now, as an extra addition to them, once you drive check or damage check them, they disappear from the game. But the difference is that you do draw a card. So in the case that you drive check, because it disappears, you would actually minus, but because of the fact that you draw a card, it's basically you have the same amount of card advantage. Now for a damage check, this is very interesting because that means you also negate the damage because the trigger will disappear, but you did take the damage, but there isn't going to be a new card in your damage zone. So not only are you going to get 100 million power on your Vanguard, you also just negated the damage that came in. Unless, of course, it's a multiple crit damage, then you're still going to get the other damage if that was just the first check. Now, of course, with the fact that these cards are a one-off, they give 100 million power, and they can potentially shut down an entire turn. There is the whole debate of, is this going to be good for the game because it's super RNG and it can shut down entire turns out of nowhere. And I can understand that sentiment because it feels like bit sacky, better said, it's super sacky from what we've seen in the past. Now, to be fair, it's just a one-off card, so the chance of you actually drive checking or damage checking this thing is very, very slim, and it's probably more likely that you're going to draw this in most of your games like you would with any other typical trigger or heal trigger. Now, of course, we can take two statements in the Seki department, as we can look at the offensive sec and, of course, the defensive sec. If your opponent drive check this against you, you will have 100 million power facing against you and a potential extra effect. From the triggers that we've seen so far, we only know about the Cray Elemental ones, which basically are these two, and they both have the same effect, and they give another 100 million power. So that means this one trigger can give 2 times 100 million power to the board, which in itself means that 2 attacks are gonna hit. Unless you just have a PG, which basically means the power doesn't really matter if you're up against a perfect guard. If your opponent has a perfect guard, the power basically means nothing. This has been the case for Vanguard since day one. Now, at the same time, if your opponent doesn't have a perfect guard, then yes, you have 100 million power facing you, but at the same time, it's just 1 damage in most cases, unless your opponent has extra criticals or there's some type of guard restrict in place where there's some annoyance with your perfect guard. This might not always come up because raw power doesn't necessarily win you the game on its own. It's usually in combination of raw power with multiple crits, or raw power that can be utilized with multi-tags, or maybe some kind of crits with guard restrict. It's usually a combination of multiple factors that wins you the game. Just raw power isn't usually enough to secure the game in Vanguard for most times, unless, of course, it's super fast and it comes out of nowhere, which can be the case with these triggers, but usually if it's the case with these triggers and it comes fast out of nowhere, it's usually on turn 1 and turn 2, and you just no guard most of your opponent's Vanguards, and if they just come with a lot of power, fine, that's great. Honestly, in the early game, I much rather want them to trigger this thing instead of a critical trigger, because a critical trigger will probably hurt me way more than this Overtrigger would do for me in turn 1 or turn 2. Now, as for the defensive aspect, yes, this card will probably shut down an entire turn, because not only does it negate the damage, which is quite annoying, but your opponent's Vanguard is at 100 million, which means no matter what type of offensive play you can muster, you cannot beat over that number. Now, of course, you can still ram into the rearguards, that's still an option, and you also have the chance that you hit your Overtrigger, which means your Vanguard can still overcome that defensive threshold, because your Vanguard also gets the 100 million power. And yes, it is quite annoying that if your opponent gets this in a situation where you would win the game, but if you think about it, this does happen in Vanguard nowadays as well, with just heal triggers and criticals and that kind of stuff. The RNG and the secondness of nature does exist. Now, I'm not gonna dismiss the fact that this card is a supercharged version of that. That's absolutely the case. But at the same time, because this mechanic exists, the whole nature of Vanguard, where the game is never over, will always apply. Because this somewhat negates power creep forever. And I say somewhat because it doesn't completely, but to explain what I mean with that is, nowadays, if your opponent builds up a specific board and a game state with the current power creep, and this happened in the end of G, and it is happening right now in Standard, triggers won't matter at a certain point, because the decks become so consistent or so aggressive that the extra 10k power increase or the extra critical that you get from these triggers doesn't really matter, because your deck inherently does way more pressure, and you can already attack like 5 or 6 times with double critical on every unit, with double guard restrict or that kind of stuff. And that extra critical or that extra 10k power doesn't really help at all at that point, as just extra fine, but you're gonna win that game anyways. And even if your opponent gets double heal in this scenario, you probably can already see at certain points, I cannot win this, even if I get all the heals in the game as my 4th damage check, it doesn't really matter, I am going to die here. Now, with the inclusion of these Overtriggers, as long as that trigger is still in your deck, you actually always have a chance to survive no matter what your opponent musters up against you, even if we power creep into oblivion, because, let's be honest, we're never gonna get to the 100 million mark. That's just not gonna happen. Of course, fingers crossed on that one. This basically secures that we always have a potential comeback mechanic in Vanguard. And this is kind of a hot take, but isn't that really the most Vanguard thing about Vanguard? The fact that you never know if you're going to win or lose. That's the most exciting part about the game. That the trigger system allows us to always have an exciting matchup or a moment in the match, because we aren't sure if we're gonna win or lose. If that is something that you don't like about Vanguard, that this Overtrigger is gonna be the super sacky thing about it, like, this has been the case for Vanguard since day one. That is why triggers are a thing. If that isn't what you like about Vanguard, then I'm like, why are you then actually playing the game itself? Because this is an integral part about the game. The moment that triggers won't matter, it isn't necessarily Vanguard as at the core what it was supposed to be. In that case, you could better play a game which doesn't have any RNG element about it, like Yu-Gi-Oh, for example, or Magic. I'm not sure if Magic has 0 RNG, except, of course, for the drawing of your cards, because that's something that will always come into play with playing a trading card game. But Vanguard, by its core, by its nature, has this inherent RNG element with it that is the trigger system, which makes every game, every match exciting, because you don't know what's going to happen. And these Overtriggers are just a supercharged element to it, but at the same time, this new type of trigger will cement that this will never disappear from Vanguard. No matter what potential power creep or combo plays or what type of things we're gonna get in the game, because there's always that small chance that you get this trigger in your defensive check and you still survive and you have a chance against your opponent. But at the same time, because this thing exists, your opponent can also put it against you in offensive play to potentially overcome that defensive nature of it. So there is an interesting dynamic behind this trigger, but at the same time, I am well aware about the potential problematic things that can come out of this thing. Because of course, with the fact that we can give a unit 100 million power, if we set this onto a rearguard that can restand, that unit will hit 2 times or maybe 3 times unless their opponent has the perfect guards to prevent it. Now, that's not to say that Bushiroad might implement card mechanics or units that can potentially negate this trigger effect. Or maybe we get defensive options that can negate the power increases they put it onto rearguard units that might abuse this. We don't know what the future is going to be. For now, we can only speculate and just try these triggers out in the actual game. I'm personally optimistic about the impact of the game. I'm more looking at the positive side because I am very positive about the trigger system in general. This is the reason why I personally start playing Vanguard, because the triggers exist. This RNG element exists to the game, which makes every game fun, interactive, and interesting. And of course, I have experienced my own luck-sack against me, and I know the salt that can come from it, but that's the reason why I play Vanguard, because that is a thing. And honestly, every time that the game power creep to a certain degree, this happened at the end of G, this happened right now in Standard, where triggers don't really matter, I basically have the less amount of joy playing the game, because now I can actually see, oh, yeah, I know that I lost the game at turn 2. Oh, I can see that I cannot win anymore because I don't have the cards, or I see that my opponent has the field set up. Yeah, shook hands, let's go over to game 2 or game 3 if we're doing multiple games, and we see from there. There's no excitement anymore that's like, oh, maybe I can get my heal trigger and survive, or maybe if I'm lucky I can get double critical here, I can still win. At some points, because the power creep is so high, these factors are out of the game, and then I'm like, it doesn't really feel like Vanguard anymore. And this type of trigger basically cements that this will always stay Vanguard. Now, of course, for anybody that's against it and is very fearful of it, you know that Bushiroad, if this is going to be a problem, Bushiroad can just ban the cards as they're just generic cards. They're like, for now, we only have these 2 promos and the 5 cards for each nation. If it's actually that problematic, I can see them just banning the cards and say, okay, Overtriggers are gone, we don't use them anymore, we're going to stick with what we have. That's definitely an outcome if they're actually that problematic. I think that's the reason why they put them at 1, that you can also just try them out. But again, to clarify, I can understand why people are a bit hesitant about Overtriggers, because they're scary with what they can do for the game. But at the same time, like, if I'm going to be realistic, like, this is peak Vanguard of what Vanguard is supposed to be. Vanguard has that RNG nature to it, what makes the game so exciting to follow and watch, because you just don't know what's actually going to happen next turn. What's going to be the next card that's going to flip open during the drive checks or damage check. And because that's an element to the game that makes it exciting to play and watch. But at the same time, if this is actually a bit of a problematic mechanic and needs to be fixed or maybe removed from the game, then definitely I will be all up for it if we have the evidence and we see that this impacts the game in a much more negative way than it does for the positive side. But now, for anybody that's still listening, let me explain the secret that I discovered about these overtriggers, which I learned by analyzing them a bit more in-depthly. Because there's still something that strikes us as odd, and that's, why did they choose specifically 100 million power for this trigger? Like, I understand that they want to make these triggers relevant forever, but they could also have done that with just 1 million or maybe 500,000, because that's a power which we probably will never reach in normal Vanguard terms. So why specifically 100 million? Well, the reason why this doesn't make sense for most of the community is because this doesn't make sense for our Western users or Western player base. Because we in the West use a 1,000 interval counting system. Because if we count from 1 to 10 to 100, then 1,000, and then once we go up 1,000, we actually use the previous system, because we go from 10,000, which is basically 10 times 1,000, then 100,000, which is 100 times 1,000, and then for the next step, it's not thousands, but it's basically 1 million. And this keeps repeating every single time that we go up with an interval of 10, and this is our 1,000 interval counting system. But Japan doesn't have that system. Japan has a 10,000 count interval system. So if they count in Japanese, you are counting like this. You're counting Ichi, Ju, Hyaku, sen, man. And man is the first, you could say, first step to this interval. So the next step is 10,000 of 10,000. Because if we keep counting, it's from man, we go to juman, hyakuman, senman, and senman is basically 10 million. So now we get to 10,000 times 10,000, and that is ichioku. And ichioku is 100 million. And now it absolutely makes sense why they specifically chose 100 million for this trigger, because if this is the second step to this 10,000 interval, the previous step to this 10,000 interval is 10,000. And what was the previous trigger in the V series? Those were 10,000 power triggers. So once all these things click together, it makes a hell of a lot more sense why they chose these overtriggers to specifically be 100 million. Because probably if Vanguard was a American or a Western centric game, so basically Bushiroad was, their headquarters were located in America or in Europe, then it's probably a good guess that the number would have been 1 million. But because it's a Japanese game, I think this is the reason why they chose specifically for 100 million, because it is the word 100 million is ichioku, which is the second step on the 10,000 interval counting system for the Japanese language. Now, does this absolutely change anything about these overtriggers? No, absolutely nothing. I could be completely wrong, but if you look at the Japanese language, this actually makes a lot more sense why they chose for this particular number. But it has nothing to do with the impact of the card or how good it's going to be and whatever impact we might see for the future. But now again, I am still quite positive about this this new mechanic to Vanguard and this new type of trigger, and I'm very curious of what the nation type cards are going to do, because they're going to do something specific to their nation, which brings some very interesting dynamic to the game itself, as that's more offensive centric, which makes a lot of sense because so far we're just looking at the vanilla card. These cards are looking more powerful as a defensive tool because they negate the damage and they just secure that you are going to get no damage a turn. But with the addition to the offensive plays, we might see some very interesting options as well. So I'm very curious of what these cards are going to bring to the game for Overdress, and of course for Premium and Standard as well. But that's where I'm gonna leave it today. Tomorrow we're gonna take a look at the difference to the new format system, where we're gonna have 3 different formats. We have Standard, Freemium or Femium, and Premium. And I want to discuss about my personal opinion about this and how this could impact the general game itself and the potential for the community as well. But that's something for tomorrow, and that's basically where I want to leave this video as it is. As always, I want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters over at patreon.com/VanguardInsider for making this video and everything on the channel possible. You guys are amazing. If you do want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/VanguardInsider and become a Patreon today. But with that said, I'm Mr. Time Leap, and I see you guys in the next one.